Well, this is climate change is literally one of the most significant challenges that human civilization has had to confront, and we can't just bury our heads in the sands. The decisions that we are making now about our emissions, our carbon emissions, are going to impact future generations, the world that we leave our children and grandchildren. And I believe there's an ethical responsibility not to leave future generations a degraded planet. So we really need to act on this problem now, and it's irresponsible to not to be talking about it. And I do think that many media organizations could do a better job in helping us have that public conversation about what to do about this problem. There's reason to believe that our political system alone isn't quite accomplishing what we need to in terms of, for example, in the U.S. passing legislation to deal with climate change. We haven't done it yet. So there's a fair amount of concern that our current system is not well equipped to deal with these huge global environmental problems where there's a hidden cost to doing business as usual that's not taken into account right now. The fossil fuel industry is essentially dumping their waste into our atmosphere for free, and so they bear no cost, and yet we know that it's doing harm to the planet, and it will do far more harm as we move forward with business as usual. So, there are those who are looking at various ways to level the playing field. There's fundamentally no problem, in my view, with the premise that the free market can solve this problem, but it can only do that if the playing field is leveled. And right now we have an unlevel playing field. We're incentivizing the burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of our environment, and not providing proper incentives to cleaner energy technologies, for example, in the U.S. And so we pretty much have to use all the tools that are available to us to try to level that playing field. And one of them, I believe, is using the law. And there are there are groups that are trying to bring cases against companies that are engaged in practices which are, destroying the global commons. They're destroying the environment, and they're not bearing any cost for doing so. And so, legal action may be one avenue to try to level the playing field so we make the right decisions.
Human-made climate change is a moral issue because it's an intergenerational injustice. The present generation is getting the benefit of burning fossil fuels, but the consequences will be borne mainly by our children and grandchildren and further generations. One of the reasons it was difficult to solve the slavery issue was that it was built into the economic system, and for the same reason, fossil fuels are now built into our system, and there's the resistance of the fossil fuel industry to finding a different path. There are alternative paths, clean energy paths that we could take, but as long as the fossil fuel industry controls the governments, it's very difficult to move down those paths. The solution to the climate problem probably does require legal action because the governments are so much under the thumb of the fossil fuel industry that they're not going to willingly make the changes that are needed. But those people who recognize what we are doing to the future of young people are beginning to take legal actions, not only in the United States, but in some other countries. And I think it is important that it be in a number of countries, because once we begin to get action in one major economic bloc, it can become worldwide. If we would have a carbon price in the United States, or say in all of Europe, or China and India, the countries that do understand that they need to make the fossil fuels pay their costs, they begin to put a price on carbon. They can have a border duty on products from other countries that do not have a carbon tax. And that would be a big incentive for these other countries to have their own carbon fee so that they can collect the money rather than have it collected at the borders by the other country. The things that I'm most concerned about climate change are the irreversible effects. Ice sheet disintegration and sea level rise is one example because it takes thousands of years to build an ice sheet. But species extermination is another irreversible potential effect of global warming. We know that a given isotherm or constant temperature line is now moving poleward at a rate of about 35 to 40 miles per decade. That means 3 or 4 miles per year. That forces species to migrate to try to stay within the climate zone that they're adapted to. Well, as long as that shift is small, they may not have to migrate, but once it becomes a large shift, it has a big effect on species. And we know this from the Earth's history. There have been times when there was global warming of several degrees, and it drove a large fraction of the species to extinction. And over millions of years, new species evolved. But that's a time scale that humans can't imagine. So if we cause large climate change now with business as usual for another century, we will cause between 20 and 50% of the species to be committed to extinction. That's an immoral thing for us to do when we have the knowledge of what we are doing. So we can't pretend that we don't know that. It's become clear that business as usual for another century will have enormous consequences, including the extermination of many species. If we want to stabilize climate, avoid passing the tipping points of ice sheet disintegration and species extermination, we need to keep global temperature from rising really above the present level. We've already increased the temperature 0.8 of a degree Celsius, which is about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still not quite as warm as it was in some prior interglacial periods, which were reasonably similar climates. Sea level was about 5 meters higher during the last interglacial. So we don't want to get as warm as or warmer than that. That means that we're going to need to have carbon dioxide on the long run no more than about 350 parts per million. So that means we're going to need to reduce fossil fuel emissions by about 5 or 6% per year if we begin within the next year or two. If we wait 10 years to begin to reduce the emissions, then we'll have to reduce them 15% a year to achieve climate stabilization this century. And that is impractical. That's why it's really important that we begin to have policies that cause a reduction in emissions. And the only way that will happen is if we put an honest price on fossil fuel emissions and give the money that's collected from the fossil fuel companies to the public.